I first became aware of Keith Vaughan when I was a student at the Slade. Must have been 76, I would say. Vaughan was a kind of painter that was appreciated most amongst other painters. He wasn't particularly well known, and there wasn't a lot in the way of images that you could see. There were a few paintings scattered about, and there were some exhibition catalogues, but he was a bit out of the mainstream, certainly. I somehow came across him as somebody who was working with a figure in an abstract, very striking, very masculine, really, in terms of his approach to the figure and his arrangement of forms. And I realised much later, too late in fact, that Keith Vaughan had actually been teaching at the Slade when I was a student there. He was working in the postgraduate painting school alongside Malcolm Hughes, who was head of the postgraduate part of the Slade. And in retrospect, I can remember walking in and out of the Slade, and there were two benches on this kind of sort of portico area, and at around 11 o'clock there were these, Malcolm Hughes was there, and there was another man who I took to be Patrick Corfield. You know, he was sort of balding and he had this kind of quite pudgy nose, and all the postgraduate staff wore this uniform. They wore a Levi's denim jacket, and they wore denim trousers, and they wore a white t-shirt. So they were all in this kind of uniform. And I'd look at this guy and thought, "Are you Patrick Corfield?" And he'd look at me, and that was that, really. Enjoying a fag, I suppose, maybe a cup of coffee, I can't remember. I didn't know that that was Keith Vaughan, and I didn't know that Vaughan actually taught in the Slade until Patrick George, my tutor in the life rooms there, was asking us as students who we'd like to have as a visiting tutor. And by that time I'd become really interested in painting figure compositions myself. So I said, well, it would be nice to have Keith Vaughan. And Patrick said, well, unfortunately, he died last year. I didn't know that Patrick George had been visiting Keith Vaughan, who was in University College Hospital, which is literally over the road from the Slade in Gower Street. He'd been going along there and keeping Keith Vaughan in his final illness, because he had terminal cancer, and eventually he took his own life in a very controlled and sort of final way that he'd planned very carefully. So that was my first encounter with Vaughan, and I never met the man, but in retrospect I must have walked past him many times when I was at the Slade, which was I graduated in 1979. Vaughan, of course, died in 1977. So that was the first in a kind of a chain of circumstances and coincidences. I went along to an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition of Vaughan's work at the Jeffrey Museum in London, which is very much an offbeat venue, really, and I make the pilgrim out there. I think it was 1981 at that point. I'd been or was about to go to Italy on a travelling scholarship. So I came back from Italy at the end of my travelling scholarship, and I landed a job, an evening class teaching job, teaching art in Islington. And part of the setting up involved getting me a library card for Islington Library. So I went along there looking for inspiration really for the lessons, and that's where I came across the Journal and Drawings book, which was published by Alan Ross in 1966. It has that very Vaughan coloured cover, a sort of greeny grey colour. And in that book I saw these photographs for the first time, these figures on the beach at Pagham, these veiled nudes, which were really, really striking, slightly disturbing, certainly unnerving images of nudes in the light of summer, but their forms kind of revealed and concealed at the same time by this gauzy material. I was so taken with these images that I photocopied them on the office photocopier, and I kept them around in with me for years in an envelope folded up. So fast forward, and then I get the opportunity to come to Aberystwyth to work in the School of Art there, and lo and behold, there is a collection of Vaughan material that had been assembled by Alistair Crawford many years ago. He'd been with Gerard Hastings, and they'd looked through a lot of material. I think it was from the man Ball, who was a big collector and one of the trustees, I think, of Vaughan's estate. Anyway, I'm not sure the exact details, but amongst those items there was Dick's book of photos, some early photography, some images that Vaughan had taken on the beach at Pagham, down on the south coast there in the summer of 1939. Or so I thought. I thought I would find amongst those photographs some of those images that I'd seen reproduced in the journals, but Dick's book of photos doesn't have those particular images, although it does have some that are on Pagham Beach and some much earlier photographs, or maybe 4 years early, around 35, 36, of Highgate ponds and just other studies. There was a big gap while I was working on other stuff, and another colleague came, Colin Cruz, and we talked about doing an exhibition of what we had in the collection at the School of Art, which was drawings, a lot of prints and illustrations, the original illustrations for projects such as Book of Gem and so on. And it was coming up for the centenary of Vaughan's birth. He was born in 1912, so it's coming up. It was 2012. By the time we'd got the exhibition together, Colin Cruz did the curating and actually lent some of his own Vaughan material, some drawings that he'd had for many years, and indeed it transpired that he had been wanting to write on Keith Vaughan himself, but he found out that Malcolm York was on the path and quite a bit ahead of him in his own research. So Colin put all this material on hold. Pull all those threads together, and you've got what comes out of it is the exhibition and the catalogue, Keith Vaughan Figure and Ground, which was planned for a Vaughan centenary, but didn't actually open in Cardiff until 2013. And in that catalogue you got essays by Robert Merrick and Harry Heuser on Vaughan as a printmaker, and you've got an essay by Colin Crews, and you've got another essay by me on the photographs, specifically on Dick's book of photographs. The photos themselves, as they are now, they were conserved in the School of Art collection, and the book, which had these boards made out of wood or kind of a thin plywood and hand stenciled letters. Those had been preserved, but the whole thing was dismembered, and the photographs were cleaned up because they had this I think this kind of cowgum material that they were stuck in with. Now, in my essay, I write about possible motivations for this book of photos that Keith Vaughan did for his brother Dick, who was trained as an RAF pilot and was killed during the war. My theory is that this book may have been compiled as a sort of memento mori, both for Dick, Vaughan's younger brother, who he admired and felt very deeply about his loss. But also, in a way, it's a document that yearns back to the pre-war years in the run-up to the Second World War. All the photographs are taken in that period, probably 1934, but up to 1939. Vaughan was a very keen photographer at that time, and had a very good Leica camera. So that enabled him to go around and document not only figures on the beach, but also buildings and social life, even some still life, some studio portraits. So it's an interesting collection of images. And in a way, I feel it was a bit like that recording project, the diaries, the mass observation diaries that were part of the war effort. Visually, Vaughan documents the run-up to the war, and later on in his diaries, which themselves are an invaluable document of his life and thoughts. You get the same feeling that he wants to record in word and image a Britain that seemed in imminent danger of not existing. There was this feeling that everything was about to change, and that whole feeling of a sort of a yearning, out of that grows certain threads in neo-romanticism, and indeed people like John Piper, Sutherland. They were recording as artists, war artists. They were recording some of the buildings and the activities of Britain in the interwar years. When you view the photographs in Dick's book, when you look at those and read alongside those images the excerpts of Vaughan's journals, it becomes clear that for Vaughan, his Leica camera acted as a kind of extension of the hand. In fact, that was the very phrase that was used in advertising the camera in the 30s, as an extension of the hand. So I use the term surrogate touch to describe that way of looking, a surreptitious and almost a vicarious way of engaging with another body, not through touch, but through the lens of a camera. And Vaughan wrote about that. He writes, "It must have been some premonition that made me spend so much of each day with my eye screwed to the viewfinder of a Leica in a desperate effort to preserve something one was afraid was vanishing forever." So that's how Figure and Ground came about. That also tells you a little bit of my interest in Vaughan and how he kind of has sort of threaded his way in and out of my life for many, many years. And the catalogues that I collected over the years are evidence of that long interest, both as an art historian and indeed as an artist. I first became aware of Keith Vaughan when I was a student at the Slade. Must have been 76, I would say. Vaughan was